Okay, in this presentation I want to go over the various bases of trade. That is the reason that nations trade. How does this work? Why do they do it? And we call each of these things a separate base of trade. So starting off, the very obvious one that goes back a long time, and this is arbitrage. And arbitrage is taking advantage of price differentials between markets. And essentially, this is buying something where it's abundant and selling it where it's scarce. And we can go back to the old days where you would go someplace and you would have things that you grew that were unique to where you were, and you traded them for things that those folks had. And your old triangle trades of manufactured goods to, if you think about India, Britain, and China, manufactured goods to India, opium to China, and then Chinese silk and tea back to Britain. That's all arbitrage, and so this is kind of a mercantile basis. And if you look back in history, I think it's very important to understand that the role of scarcity. We look at the purchase of Manhattan, and there's this big thing. It's very trite to say, "Oh, the Dutch bought it for $24 of goods." And, that people say, "Oh, it's some blankets and some trinkets." And I'm like, well, there's also a knife and an axe head in there. And, yeah, it's $24 of goods in Holland, but in the United States or the native area of North America at that time, these things were totally scarce. You didn't have metallurgy. You didn't have these things. And, it's like someone selling someone a tricorder and a phaser. I mean, it's just these things were totally scarce. And so the Indians were basically giving land, which they had abundance of, for something extremely scarce. And that's what the Dutch had brought with them. So this is the earliest form of trade. And it generally depends on you having a difference in abundance of just goods and resources. Now, we start getting into other bases of trade that have to do with the functioning of the economy, and the first one is absolute advantage, and this is Adam Smith's idea. And nations here are going to trade goods based on the efficiency with which they produce them, and so essentially we're all going to produce that which you're most efficient at doing. And so I'm going to export a good that, if I export to you, it's because I'm more efficient at producing the good than you are, and vice versa. And if we do this, the idea is, the benefit for everyone is that by having larger markets, we're going to have greater division of labor, and we're going to have, which is going to produce gains in efficiency. And so in the absolute advantage world, not only am I taking advantage of my own efficiencies and your efficiencies, we extend these efficiencies because now I'm producing, if I'm exporting chairs, because I make chairs really well, I make chairs much better than you do. Well, the fact that I now have a larger market for chairs means I'm going to even get more efficient at producing chairs. Meanwhile, you're shipping me food or wine, whatever, and now that you have a bigger market, more efficient. That's absolute advantage. Very simple concept. Compare this to comparative advantage. And you have a lot of readings on this, so I'm not going to go too long into it, but comparative advantage is a very different idea than absolute advantage. Please make sure you understand the difference and do not confuse them either explicitly by calling one by the other name or implicitly by maybe talking about comparative advantage and in your explanation of comparative advantage actually describing absolute advantage. Happens a lot. Comparative advantage is very awkward to talk about because we have to talk about two nations trading two goods. And each nation will specialize in the good for which they have the relatively lower opportunity cost. Where the opportunity cost of a good is the amount of that good, or rather the opportunity cost of a good is the amount of another good that could be produced with the resources used to produce one unit of the first good. Wow. Awkward. But the idea is if I spend my time making chairs instead of making wine, how much wine, do I give up? If I say, all right, I'm going to make chairs instead of wine, maybe in the amount of time it takes me to make a chair, I could have made 1 bottle of wine. The other nation might face a different thing, that, well, in the amount of time they take to produce chairs, they, might only make, they might be bad at making chairs, so maybe they would have made 2 bottles of wine. So their opportunity cost of making a chair is 2 bottles of wine. My opportunity cost is 1. Therefore, I have the lower opportunity cost. I will make chairs and trade it to them for wine. That's comparative advantage. Notice it is a reciprocal thing. My comparative advantage in the production of chairs over wine implies that the other country has a comparative advantage in wine over chairs. Also notice how awkward it is to talk about this. I have to talk about 2 nations and 2 goods. And when I talk about my comparative advantage, I can't just say I have a comparative advantage in the production of chairs. I have to say I have a comparative advantage in the production of chairs versus wine compared to that other particular nation, because it's not a universal thing, right? My comparative advantage is between, so there's a comparative advantage between the United States and Canada. There might be different comparative advantages between the United States and Mexico. Okay, so it's nation-specific and it's good-specific. Confused? Well, like I say, you really need to read up on this. This is the big one, but in this presentation, I'm trying to give you kind of an overview, so I'm going to move quickly on to the next base of trade, which is factor endowment. And this comes up a lot as an alternative, and it's much easier to understand. I think it's very straightforward in the idea we're now going to talk about factors. In the Ricardian model, the only factor of production is labor. He just looks at labor, and that's what we're talking about, opportunity costs. In this one, we assume that nations have differing factor endowments, and we have 2 factors here, labor and capital. And so the idea is that there may be some goods that require relatively more capital than labor to produce. So these are capital-intensive goods. And there may be some goods that require more labor than capital, and these are labor-intensive goods. And no surprise, when you have nations with differing factor endowments, a nation that is relatively abundant in capital will produce capital-intensive goods, and nations that are relatively abundant in labor will produce labor-intensive goods. Straightforward. A lot of people like it. You can call it the HO model, and it's got a good name. The problem is the Leontief paradox. And he noticed in 1954, Leontief is a guy, and he's an economist, and he noticed that he looked at trade, and he said, the United States, in 1954, very capital-intensive compared to the rest of the world. He noticed that the United States was exporting labor-intensive goods and importing capital-intensive goods. And so the thing is that this factor endowment model, and it's not just the U.S., this has been replicated elsewhere. He's just the guy that's noticed it. The problem is that a lot of trade doesn't follow this pattern. Comparative advantage, by the way, simple, unbelievably simple theory. There's a lot of empirical evidence that, yes, trade follows that pattern. So factor endowment, we got to put an asterisk by, right, as there's little empirical support for saying this is the way it works. But people hang on to it because they say it's got to have something to it. The last base of trade is the most modern one, and it's often not included in textbooks because it's very new. And it doesn't have a really good name. It can be called imperfect competition. Other people will call it economies of scale. And Paul Krugman is associated. There are a couple other people. Obstfeld is another guy I worked with him. But Paul Krugman is most associated with this, and this is before he became a columnist for the New York Times. He was a very respected international economist. Still is, but I think being not an international columnist, international economist, he still is, but the columnism is his journalism is kind of getting in the way. However, back in the day when he did math, he noticed that you had a lot of industries that would be characterized by an economy of scale, meaning that as there was an increased volume being produced of a good, the unit cost of production would decrease. Right? Now, this can be, you can have 2 types of economies of scale. You can have an internal economy of scale, which is realized within a company, and That is to say, as the company produces more and more of the good, the unit cost goes down. The most obvious example here is something with high R&D costs. When you build a B-2 bomber, the first one costs a couple $2 billion, right? And then after, or maybe $20 billion, or all the R&D costs that go into the first one are huge. And then from that point on, as you stamp out copies, the more of them you do, the lower the cost goes. And this is, not just B-2 bombers, but, the first iPhone, the first iPod, a computer, anything with a large R&D cost. The more you produce, the lower, you can amortize the R&D costs over a larger number, and so the unit cost goes down. This is an internal economy of scale, right? It's realized within the company. We also have external economies of scale, which are realized in a geographic area. And this is to say, when you have a lot of companies, producing in one place, right, there can be an economy of scale, usually due to a local market for inputs. And the world is full of examples of this. Silicon Valley is an obvious one, where if you want to produce high-tech stuff, you go to Silicon Valley because they have clean rooms, they have a labor supply. I remember when I lived there, I would hear ads for computer programmers on the radio, and I actually first time I ever built a computer was in Silicon Valley, and I went to the computer store, and all these guys with the pocket protectors standing around, and don't put that motherboard in there. I put that in my kid's computer, took it out the next day. Point is, there's just all that stuff there, and it makes it easy to produce. Now, Silicon Valley is not the only example. Hollywood is a great example. Dalton, Georgia was the center of rug production. And so, there's a lot of these areas, Wall Street, there's a lot of these places when you clump people together, they have an external economy of scale, and the cost of doing business goes down. The average cost as more and more weight, as there's a larger and larger number of people there. And we see a lot of these concentrations around the world. So what's the point of all this? Well, the idea is if it's more efficient for either there to be fewer companies producing things like, say, jet aircraft is a great example of an industry where the R&D costs kind of force the competition away, and we're down to two major producers, right, of large commercial aircraft. And so you can have these internal ones, or you can have external ones, these geographic concentrations. The idea is that it doesn't, everyone can't have an industry, right? You can't have it spread around. It tends to focus. Therefore, you're going to specialize, and you're going to look in a geographic area or within a company to have a more global, large-scale, market. You're going to sell to a larger number of people. And this leads to what Krugman has called reciprocal dumping. And here the idea is just everybody has their own little specializations, and and the key thing about these specializations are there's no logic to them. There's nothing inherent about one company over another. There can be maybe there are two producers of large jets. There's nothing in this economy of scale to say, well, it should be one in the United States and one in Europe, right? It's just that there can be only two. It's not quite Highlander. There can be only two or three or whatever. And the thing is, where do you get these? And very often, happy accidents can be the result of this. Dalton, Georgia. One reason that Dalton, Georgia was the carpet capital was that they had a folk art that put loops. They wove loops through things and cut off the ends to make kind of a shag thing, and they made sweaters and stuff out of it. But that's how they wanted to make carpets, and so they said, hey, you happen to have the skills we're looking for. Other places, it's just kind of like maybe you can manufacture the accident. So, like I say, there's nothing inherent to one place or the other. It's kind of arbitrary where you get these. So, however, the idea is you do need specialization. And it's called dumping, and it's kind of the idea is, well, I'm going to specialize in this and you specialize in that. We're going to dump products on each other, and it's called dumping because you're going to sell in the foreign market at a price below what you would be able to sell in your domestic market, right? And that is technically dumping, or from some people's point of view, that's considered dumping. But the idea is, well, no, the reason we're selling at the lower price is we're taking advantage of economy of scale. And so we can sell, and we're probably selling at a lower price back home as well as a result of this. Everyone's happy, right? That's reciprocal dumping. Although the problem is it looks like regular old dumping, and sometimes you get trade actions against it. Krugman went on, well, I don't know what Krugman went on, but Krugman's theory opened the idea up, opened up a possibility of strategic trade, and that is that governments might attempt to develop their own domestic economies of scale, produce their own happy accidents. And the idea, certainly our jet aircraft industry is a good example of that, where the Europeans say, hey, we notice that there is this declining number of large-scale producers of large jet aircraft. And so what we want to do is we want to invest in a European producer and back it, back its R&D, fund its development of a new aircraft. And so we want to make sure we get one of these. We don't want the world to be dominated by, because it could very well have been Lockheed and Boeing, or McDonnell Douglas and Boeing, right? But it's Airbus and Boeing. And the idea, the idea is that the Europeans, by supporting the industry and investing in it and paying the R&D costs, they were able to guarantee a spot in the industry. And this has led people to say, oh, wow, great, the state did that, and, maybe that's something we can do. Maybe we can produce happy accidents. Maybe we can, I live in North Carolina, where I've researched Triangle Park, where they're like, hey, we have these 3 colleges, NC State, UNC, and Duke, right near each other. Great, if we had a park with laboratories and office space in the middle, we might attract a lot of companies and work like a charm. And so now, Research Triangle (RTP) is a major engine for North Carolina growth, and so that's a happy, not exactly an accident, but they kind of produced. There wasn't a happy accident. We had 3 universities, and they kind of invested in it. The thing is that economists are like, yeah, you can do this, but beware. Beware the build it and they will come thing. And in fact, Krugman, even though his theory opens the door to strategic trade, he's actually very critical of the concept. He doesn't believe that governments are able to necessarily foresee things, and he's highly skeptical of it. And a great example of a failure would be, for a long time there was a lot of European investment and Japanese investment in high-definition TV. And the governments in Japan and Germany were plunking down money, and candidate Bill Clinton, as opposed to President Clinton, but candidate Clinton complained about that on the campaign trail. And the thing is, there's HD TV today, and guess it's not Japanese or German technology, it's American technology, because digital technology, the others were analog, and it turns out that it's easier to do digital. And so even, the idea is the governments of Germany and Japan were moving first, they were investing in analog technology, and in the end, the technological innovation from the free market decided to go another way. And if we had invested, we might have invested in totally different technology, and we being the United States government. And so the idea is our government's really able to foresee these things the way investors are? And there's just a lot of doubt about governments being clairvoyant enough to do this. So strategic trade is a very dicey thing, although economists have to admit, yes, there are cases. Airbus is a great example where these things happen, and RTP, Research Triangle Park, another example. And so, they have to admit, yes, there can be cases where this works, but we just have to be very careful. So, okay, there's a quick and dirty look at 5 different bases of trade. Comparative advantage is the big one. The others are valid. Maybe not the Heckscher only one. Actually, that's like the weakest one in there. But we think, arbitrage. Yes, we sell oil. Saudi Arabia, and, they trade based on arbitrage. Can absolute advantage be out there? Sure, yeah, absolute advantage can certainly be part of the thing. We think comparative advantage is more important, but and this imperfect competition, economies of scale, they think that explains a lot of some of these more high-tech industries. So, I hope this kind of gives you a broad feel for the different bases of trade and helps kind of sort things out for you.